What's up YouTube? Welcome back to another Fire Emblem Engage tier list. In this video, we will be discussing the best personal skills for each unit in Fire Emblem Engage, while also using unit context and viability in mind. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below whether you agree, disagree, or would just like to have a friendly Fire Emblem discussion. Without further ado, first up we have Divinely Inspiring on Alear, which is easily S tier. This ability allows adjacent allies to deal +3 damage while also taking 1 less damage. This is an incredibly strong skill that is crucial in both the early and mid game. The only thing that slightly falls off late game is the 1 less damage, as enemies have incredibly high strength and magic attacks at this point. However, the +3 damage is still beneficial, which is why it deserves this ranking. This skill alone has been the breakthrough to beating so many chapters on Maddening for me. Next up is Alabaster Duty on Vander. This skill gives Vander and Alear +5 crit when standing adjacent to each other. While not a terrible ability on a different unit, I'm placing this in D tier. Vander falls off too hard in the mid game, and the realistic possibility for you to not only land a crit, but a crit that matters in the early game is very rare. Not to mention that they also need to be standing next to each other, which could be difficult to achieve in some situations. Next is Verdant Faith on Clan. Similar to Vander's skill, this gives both Alear and Clan +10 hit during combat. I believe this belongs in C tier as it actually has some viability early game. Since Alear is a sword user, Clan will most likely be the one benefiting from this as a tome user. Regardless, there's definitely some value here in the early game, but not in the mid or late game, which is why it's so low. Next up is Crimson Shear, which is another skill like Vander and Clan skills, which I'll be placing in C tier. It is Fram's skill that gives +10 avoid to both Alear and Fram. Also similar to the previous two units is that they fall off in the mid game, which means the skill will see limited use. Now that we're done with those 3 skills, we're on to Self-Improver. This is a strong skill of Alfred that I'll be placing in A tier. If Alfred uses weight without attacking or using items, he is granted +2 strength for 1 turn. This is strong to give you that extra strength boost to bait enemies in both the early and mid game. Since Alfred isn't the strongest unit, he'll be falling short of S tier, but early game, he's very powerful. Next is Energized, which is Etier's skill. It holds a solid place in B tier for me. It is similar to Alfred's skill, but it only grants +2 strength when recovering HP using an item, which is much more niche. I personally had a lot of success with Etier, but due to the unit being poor, this skill can possibly be placed in C tier. Now we have Boucheron's Move to Tears skill, which I'll be placing in C tier. When an ally joins a chain attack in this unit's combat, the unit deals +2 damage. Boucheron isn't the strongest unit and falls off hard, but that extra poke in the early game could be beneficial. Next up is Celine's Gentle Flower in B tier. Recovery items used by allies within 2 spaces heal 50% HP. Once again, this is a strong skill that you can capitalize on early in the game. If you're fortunate enough to have a Celine that scales into the mid game, this can be valuable as it's a nice way to heal up your army quicker. On the other hand, if your Celine is falling off, I'd probably place this skill in C tier. Next is Admiration by Luis, that is in my opinion the worst skill in the game. Therefore, I will be placing it in D tier. If 2 females are adjacent within 2 spaces, this unit takes 2 less damage during combat. It is incredibly niche to have 2 female allies next to you for a +2 defense on a unit that has high defense already. Even mid to late game, this doesn't serve much value as once again, his defense will already be so good you don't need to mess up your positioning with your other units in order to boost his defense. Now we have Fairytale Folk on Chloe, which is a must-use early game skill especially for Maddening. Despite falloff, I'll be placing it in A tier due to its early game strength. If a male and a female ally are adjacent within 2 spaces, the unit deals +2 damage during combat. As you can see, it is a good combo with Divinely Inspiring if you're using male Alear. Your Chloe will essentially be dealing +5 damage with +1 defense, while also being able to double most enemy units. Next is Jeanne's Expertise, which would be placed higher if on a better unit. Unfortunately, it will have to go in C tier. The skill grants unit enhanced stat growth when leveling up, which from what I know is +20% to each stat. This could be strong if you plan on using Jeanne, but if you do, I recommend reclassing him. Next is an extremely strong skill called Fair Fight on Diamant, which is easily A tier. If unit initiates combat, grants +15 hit to unit and foe if foe is able to counterattack. Now, this sounds like it might be hurting you rather than helping, but you want to promote Diamant as soon as you get him so that he can wield axes. You want to completely step away from swords so that his axe hit rate will be dramatically increased. The next skill is Amber's Aspiring Hero, which I'll be placing in C tier. If no other units are within one space of unit or foe, grants plus 20 hit at the cost of minus 10 avoid during combat. This may be strong in niche situations, but I'm personally not a fan of the skill as you often don't want to be sending your units out alone. But on the rare chance that you can possibly just send him in first to get the bonus, then it may show some value, but even then, it's not the best. Next up is Jade's Meditation, which is extremely lackluster in my opinion, which is why I'll be placing it in D tier. Similar to Alfred's Self-Improver, if unit uses weight without attacking or using items, grants plus 2 resistance for 1 turn. Now, this is pretty bad because there's almost never a situation where you'll benefit off a general or a Great Knight baiting in a tome user. If you find a reclass for Jade that somehow works with this ability, maybe C tier, but still bad nonetheless. The next skill is Get Behind Me on Alchrist. This has to go in S tier for being such an amazing skill while also being on a strong unit. When an ally within 2 spaces is attacked, grants plus 3 strength to unit for 1 turn. This skill can activate every turn if you keep it in mind and position your Alchrist correctly. An extremely strong skill that doesn't even fall off late game, especially if you're able to double with Alchrist, giving a total of plus 6 damage. Now we're on Generosity by Citrine. A solid A tier, arguably B tier skill. When this unit uses a healing item, adjacent allies also recover the same amount of HP. This means that if you're in a group of allies that are all weak, you're able to easily walk next to them, pop an elixir, and practically heal yourself and all allies adjacent to you up to full. This is strong both in the early and late game, granted you're able to find the situation to pull it off. Next is Share Spoils on Lapis. C tier, possibly B tier, but I'm going to go with C since I feel Diamant is just a better option over Lapis. If there is an ally within 1 space, grants hit and avoid plus 10, but at the cost of minus 10 crit to unit. Since there are a lot of routes for Lapis, this directly conflicts with the Swordmaster route, which seems to be the most common on her. If you're going Great Knight and want to wield axes, then I'd say this might be in B tier. It depends on what you choose in your game. Next up is Train to Kill on Yunaka, a B tier skill that could be an A depending on the choices in your game. While unit occupies terrain that provides a void bonus, grants plus 15 crit. Since it seems a bit niche, I thought it should be ranked lower. But after consulting with some other Fire Emblem experts, they explained that boosting her crit and other means on top of the skill can almost guarantee a crit every time. So it's potentially a powerful skill if you invest around it. Next are on Will to Win with Saphir, a B tier skill on a decently strong unit. If unit's HP is 50% or less at the start of combat, grants hit and avoid plus 20 during combat. This allows for Saphir to wield low hit rate axes and connect pretty consistently. The drawback is that you receive Saphir late in the game and you also have the contingency that you need to take damage and you have to play around not really healing your Saphir up past 50% HP. Next is Single Minded on Ivy, a C tier skill that I debated heavily on putting in D tier, but I love this unit too much to do that. During combat with a foe who was also unit's most recent opponent, grants plus 20 to hit. Despite having strong defenses on Ivy, she doesn't want to be frontlining too often as there are tanks that should be filling that role instead. Due to this, there are not many times you're able to get this skill to activate, but if someone finds a way to have tanky Ivy, this would be a way stronger skill, especially since Ivy lacks in hit rate. Next up is Blinding Flash on Kagetsu, a solid B tier skill that if your unit initiates combat, inflicts minus 10 avoid on foe during combat. This ensures Kagetsu is able to land hits more often. That's only if he's not landing critical hits, as critical hits ignore hit rate and are locked at 100%. The reason I have the skill in B tier and not C is because unlike most skills, there's a low contingency. All you need is Kagetsu to initiate the attack to activate this skill. Next is Not Quite for Zelkov in B tier, a similar skill to Kagetsu, but instead lowers hit by 10 on the opponent if unit initiates attack. Since Zelkov will have a high avoid in general, that minus 10 hit will be enough to save many Maddening chapters. Not to mention you could pair this on the avoid tile and be practically invincible with the right build. Next is one of my favorite skills called Big Personality on Hortensia. I'll be arguably placing this in A tier. When unit uses a healing staff, grants plus 1 range. I personally found this to be incredibly helpful, as there have been some situations where I needed to heal a frontline unit, but also be out of range of enemy mages and archers. Additionally, there was a time or two where that plus 1 range helped to even reach a psychic from across the map. Not to mention, Hortensia is an amazing damage dealer and mobile healer on top of that. Next is the first of 2 similar skills for Hortensia's retainers, called Stunning Smile on Rosado. A niche C tier, possibly B tier skill, but Rosado unfortunately isn't the strongest unit and the contingency of the enemy being male is a hit or miss half the time. For Hortensia's second retainer, Goldmary, she possesses the skill Disarming Sigh. Another C tier skill that would be B tier if the best option for her wasn't to promote into a Great Knight. If foe is male, inflicts -20 hit on that enemy during combat. Unfortunately, Goldmary won't be dodging many hits even if the skill does activate, but it is still slightly helpful nonetheless and not bad enough for D tier. Next up is Mega Killing on Ana in C tier. Initially, I thought the skill was much stronger than it was, but that was only due to me not using Ana in my Maddening playthrough. I personally never ran into money issues, but I figured if someone was able to make a money farm with Ana, then they would be able to have much better equipment. Unfortunately, after consulting other players, the money you receive in the game is in fact enough for most playthroughs. Next is Weapon Insight on Linden, a solid C tier skill that could have potentially seen some usage in B tier. If unit is equipped with a weapon of lower level than the enemy, grants +20 crit during combat. Most of the time, the enemies will be using silver weapons in the late game, which means that Linden will almost always have that +20 crit, especially if you forge some of his tomes in the blacksmith. However, he's just a relatively weak unit that is received way too late and there are better options. Next is Racket of Solm on Tamara, a C tier, possibly D tier skill that inflicts -5 crit on enemies within 3 spaces. Most of the time, enemies will probably have a 1 to 5% crit rate, so this skill can completely negate this. However, if there's a crit meant to happen, it's meant to happen. So if there's an enemy with a killing edge that initially has a 50% crit rate, but you drop it down to 45%, it's most likely still going to crit. But it's a nice niche to have in the mid game to save you from those 1% crits, granted your Tamara is nearby. Now we have Knightly Escort on Marin, a D tier skill in my opinion, but possibly C tier if you force it more than I did. When 2 or more female allies are within 2 spaces, grants +5 hit and avoid to unit and allies. It's a nice little bonus, but most of the time it's not going to make a difference and it's difficult to surround Marin with 2 female allies at most times. Now we're on Blood Fury for Panette, a very strong skill in A tier. If unit's HP is not at max after combat, grants +10 crit as long as unit's HP stays below max. Similar to Saphir's ability, this one serves a much better purpose and is activated as long as you're under max HP, not 50%. Additionally, you receive Panette in the mid game, so she gets a lot of value with this. You're going to want to give Panette a +2 killer axe so that her crit rate averages around 60%, an absolute beast of a unit paired with this skill. Next is one of the worst abilities in the game, Charmer for Folgado. Easily in D tier as during combat with an enemy who is also unit's most recent opponent, inflicts -10 crit on that enemy. It's self-explanatory on how rare it is to activate this skill, and even if it does activate, it's not going to stop a killing edge. Regardless, you're not going to want Folgado to tank a killing edge one turn just to walk back into it next turn. Another pretty bad skill that goes in D tier is Seconds on Bunei. On eating a packed lunch, unit may obtain another of the same item, but the trigger percent equals luck. Even though packed lunches give you more HP than vulneraries, you're only permitted 1 packed lunch at one time in the game, which means you only have 1 chance within a chapter to land this skill. By the mid to late game when you have Bunei, you're most likely going to want to use elixirs over vulneraries anyway, which heal more than packed lunches. Next is Party Animal for Pandreo, landing in A, possibly B tier. Grants a bonus to hit and avoid equal to 3 times the number of allies and foes within 2 spaces. This means that your Pandreo is capable of healing in some potentially risky situations and end up living due to this skill. While it's not a reliable strat, sometimes you need to use every resource at your disposal to beat Maddening difficulty. Next is Seattle's Curious Dance, landing in C tier. At the start of the turn, allies within 2 spaces of unit recover 10% of their max HP. Not a bad skill by any means, but it could potentially tamper with your Panette or Saphir skills by accidentally restoring their HP. In other situations, it's just a nice little boost on HP that could potentially save a unit's life in a later turn. Second to last, we have Fell Protection on Veil. Similar to the skill Divinely Inspiring, you receive this unit so late that I have to put it in C tier. Adjacent allies deal +1 damage and take 3 less damage. Very strong in the late and post game, but doesn't help much on beating the actual game. Last but not least, we have a Contemplative on Mavier, an A tier skill that I dropped down to B tier last minute. If unit uses weight without attacking or uses items, grants +2 defense for 1 turn. This would be stronger if Mavier needed this boost, but his defenses are already pretty good that it's often unnecessary. It's also only viable if you're using Mavier to bait units closer to you, which you may not be doing if you continue to use the same tank you've been using the entire game, rendering him both useless and the skill useless. Once again, if you enjoyed, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your own opinions down below.